Thank you so much, Aziz and Deborah, for inviting me to be here as part of this wonderful gathering. It's a real pleasure to be in dialogue with Sunil and Roshini, who have an enormous legacy of work that they've made over the last 30 years. And we're going to try in this very short amount of time to maybe kind of encapsulate some of these dialogues. As artists, you've both shared a history of working with independent photography as a critical practice. And today we're going to be discussing some of the intersecting and multifaceted aspects to your practice that go beyond just the photographic work that you've been making. I'm going to start by introducing both of the speakers, and then we'll kind of use that as a point of departure. Roshini Kempadoo is an artist, professor in photography and visual culture at Westminster University. She has worked for many years around issues of race representation in the Caribbean diaspora, visual arts and culture. Her work has been included in many exhibitions, including the current Women in Revolt, Art and Activism in the UK, and Life Between Islands, Caribbean British Art, both at Tate Britain, Fragments of Epic Memory at the AGO in Toronto, amongst others. She published her monograph, Creole in the Archive, Imagery, Presence and Location of the Caribbean Figure in 2016. Sunil Gupta has been working with photography as a critical practice for many years, focusing on race, migration and queer issues. He's a professorial fellow at the UCA Farnham. A retrospective of his work was shown at the Photographers Gallery and at the Image Centre in Toronto in between 2020 and 2021, curated by Mark Seeley. He's published numerous monographs over the years, including his most recent book, Come Out, with Stanley Barker. His works are included in many, many established private public collections, including the Tokyo Museum of Photography, Tate, V&A, MoMA, amongst others, and he's represented by several global galleries, including in London, New York, Delhi, etc., etc. In the background, the rolling slideshow of both Roshini and Sunil's vast archives that delve into the spaces beyond their artistic practice. I invite you all on this journey over the next 40 to 45 minutes as we kind of, I think, pinpoint some of the key themes within the work that you've been making with these amazing artists, agitators, activists, and incredible human beings as well. So I'm going to kick off with the first question. And the way this is going to be is that I'm not going to be asking all the questions. I know both of you would also like to ask each other questions as well before we open it up to questions. So I think for me, I wanted to start with your work, Sunil, in particular. Art making and activism has really been part of the core of your practice, and it charts a very particular history with the GLC and the formation of Autograph in the 1980s, where you've often spoken about insisting upon a presence in and reasserting kind of South Asian history back into the canon. I think looking now where we are, 30 years later, 35 years later, were you aware at the time that you, alongside some of your peers, including Roshini, were making this history, creating an institution that continues to imprint this legacy upon the kind of history of not just photography, but visual culture today?
So, yeah, we're not going to talk to the pictures. If you want a particular picture to be discussed, you could raise it after, maybe. So, yes, I basically picked up the camera to document. So from the get-go, the political activity came before the camera. The camera was there to document it. And so I kind of followed that through into a documentary practice, etc., arriving, emerging into the early 80s into a very post-colonial, postmodern moment in London. I'm going to cut the stories, compress it as far as possible, where we had the first Black student show at the RCA. Black didn't mean skin color, it meant all kinds of people who has heritage belonged to, had once been colonies of the British Empire, including the Irish, for example. And so from there, it seemed natural to reject the RCA route to Cork Street and commercial galleries, but instead cross the Thames to the GLC, to the town hall, to figure out how to make proper politics, party politics with the Labour Party, to try and get rid of Margaret Thatcher and to do what we can for the people of London in particular, in our case, and discover how local politics worked for us, and to offer our skills as artists and articulate people at that, because it was a generation of people who'd emerged with MFAs and MAs from all over England, including nearby from Wolverhampton. We had Eddie Chambers and Keith Piper, who kicked off a kind of black arts, visual arts moment. And it sort of followed through across the art forms and so on. So come 1986, there was an exhibition at the Brixton Art Gallery called The Black Experience, sponsored by the JLC, curated by a certain Monica Baker, who selected 10 individual photographers to have 10 pictures each. I was one of them. My 10 pictures are on show in this show, so that's what connects me to this project, to this exhibition, I mean. And it's through that process of organizing that I further got to know somebody else who I'd only corresponded with but never met, which was a young woman who was working for a magazine called 10/8, who occasionally would write me letters. It was called Roshini Kempadoo. And then we began to meet. So basically, the Black Experience exhibition kicked off, I think, nearly 2-year period of photographers of color meeting to try and maintain some networking, a bit like the title of the show again. And it was a kind of a moment of no funding, so there's no money now. Show happened, show finished, show came down. Then people said, now what do we do? What's the next step? There was no immediate next step in front of us. And photography, for those of you familiar with it, is a very singularly kind of personal activity. I think unlike any other art form, especially in the representational ones, it's not like film where you have a crew. It's not like drama where there's a cast. You know, it's even visual artists to some extent hang out together, I suspect. But photographers, no, they're like in deep competition with each other, aren't we?
But I think that's interesting because Roshini, you've only recently kind of come or moved to London, but for your formative years, you were in the Midlands.
For my formative years, if you think about kind of teenage years, I was in Guyana.
Oh, right.
So there was And then you're quite right, I then stayed and came to the Midlands. So I encountered a kind of, and I did my undergraduate actually here in Walsall. And of course then
you
got
did?
to know,
Okay.
I did it here.
Didn't know that.
Yeah. And so I was kind of outside of London, and being outside of London, it was really interesting to see how going through undergraduate work, you could potentially become a kind of a jobbing documentary photographer. And so one of the things that happened, of course, was taking me into London for jobs with the GLC again. The anti-racist campaign was very much, I was very much part of that. And I also joined Format after my undergraduate degree, which meant that the Format as a women's picture agency was kind of trying to generate work and through a documentary form. So they were really also my mentors as well. And there was a distinct lack of women of color as part of Format, but I did get to know others there. And at the time also the unions were very much active as well. So I was, for example, NALGO at the time, which was a trade union around journalism, was doing Black Caucus meetings. And that was a really interesting time. So they'd only let in photographers of color to go and do the work. So it was a very interesting kind of moment of coming out of university and then realizing that this political space was actually really galvanizing us in a very particular way. But I guess one of the things that I wanted to also kind of follow on with, we could talk more about that, and I'm sure there'll be questions. What is to do with that kind of moment, really? So that at the moment, I think there seems to be a real diving into that period of history, 80s and 90s. And I'm very curious about that. I think there's something that, on the one hand, history sometimes is used to kind of contain us, right? Put us into a box. And what's nice to see about this particular show is the way in which that kind of decade, if you like, is kind of being updated and expanded upon and questioned through contemporary work. So I think that that's a really interesting way of thinking about historical narratives in a way. But I'm kind of wondering, Sunil, what you think, apart from the politics, what was it that was actually really galvanized us in that kind of way? And why do you think that kind of fetishization, if you like, of the Black arts movement is occurring now? I don't know if you want to kind of contribute to that. I've had my own thoughts.
I can only take a guess at it. So it's not just the Black arts movement, of course, that's our particular common history with autograph, and it's across. I find even the lesbian and gay stuff now reincarnated as queer, which I find slightly, that's another discussion about how queer has become so acceptable, but lesbian and gay never was. And what do those shifting identities mean? So I'm wondering whether we're living in a particular moment where we're surrounded by a wider world that's really shifting to the right. I read this morning in the paper somewhere that this feels like the 1930s in Europe. Everybody's going right. And there's anxiety. There's a lot of anxiety. And I don't know if it was the same for you, but for me, the 80s were very euphoric because in all our diversities, we had a common political agenda, which was to get rid of Reagan and Thatcher. So it was like the chant was Thatcher out. There'd be lesbians and gays, there'd be Black people, there'd be pensioners, everybody, minors, everyone came together around to get rid of the Tories back in the 80s. And it actually seemed possible. And for a while, it seemed the world was getting better. And I think it was a period of hope, despite all the strikes and all that. We had a whale of a time.
And it was also mobilizing as well. We were mobilized in a
Yeah,
right?
I mean, we spent our evenings going to meetings, not going down to the pub having a pint. We were like mobilizing around something or the other, going to all of those wonderful places like Conway Hall and whatnot, or trade union meetings, and you were part of them. I was part of the NUJ. It just seemed like a natural progression, and all kinds of things were kind of appeared to be mushrooming. Even in terms of personal politics, it was much cooler to be with somebody of a different race. Only. Do you remember? It was like very essentialist to date somebody of the same race. I mean, I ended up with somebody, but that's a different. That was an accident. But so actually, so like trying to embrace and find the other in all kinds of guises. I think it was. We thought we saw a roadmap, or we thought we were building towards some kind of roadmap. We thought we made autograph to create a kind of possibilities and pathways for people to counter not just the opportunities in photography, but to challenge the larger Tory establishment through the work. And, we didn't want to just withdraw into a kind of Brixton Black ghetto mentality, just like enclosed. So do you remember we had this very early newsletter, which we produced on an Amstrad machine, but we wrote about, we criticized MoMA's shows. We took on the Tate, and with the dot matrix printer, that wasn't going to stop us. We had very ambitious plans about it.
But I'm also wondering whether there was a moment that in relation to our age group, that we were some of the few coming through the university system as well, the higher education system in a way. Because if I think about Keith and, Sonia, yourself, there might have been, for the first time, there was a kind of a group of us that were coming through that system with and able to have voice in a way. So I was thinking about you talking about the RCA and that formation also, and that voice coming through the institution as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think also partly that's why it happened in the 80s, because there could have been a 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And I have met people who came before me, and I even briefly belonged to something called Caribbean Craft Circle, which was the older generation. But they didn't have the clever young people who got fancy MAs from fancy schools. They weren't articulate in that way. They couldn't take on the Arts Council. They didn't know how to take on the Arts Council. And they basically wanted a market. So on weekends, we would get a stall somewhere like Covent Garden Market and sell our wares, whether it was jewelry or a painting, or in my case, a big floppy photograph. I don't know what I was thinking, sitting there with this photograph, thinking some passerby was going to buy a pic. But so I think that was, so we were both fortunate, but also accidentally, the education system gave us access, and then we kind of found each other.
Yeah.
I mean,
it was a kind of a
so I found other
network.
Black people in the RCA, not in photography, but in places like glass or graphic design. And then I met another breed of person who was the Indian student from India.
Yeah.
So who looked at me and said, I ain't come here to become diaspora, I'm Indian.
Yes.
I came from Baroda, I'm going back to Baroda. I won't mention any names, but every year at the RCA, I got an Indian student from Baroda who refused to, who were like, I'm making my art. And then they were the ones who would get the big fancy commissions from the Serpentine and the you name it, big galleries, where we were saying, no, we don't want to deal with them. But that was the other thing that's changed now.
I think
so when we were young, we had no ambition to be in the Tate.
Yes. Well, that's
now it's like everybody and their mother wants to be in all, and they're desperate to buy it. But we would have said no.
No. But I think that's interesting because going back to what you were saying, Roshini, about this idea of, I think what I found, especially now being from a different generation and growing up in the UK, is that there's a real desire for people to put you in a box based on what you look like.
Yeah.
And that goes not just for your skin color, but that also goes from, and it's very well articulated in the installation downstairs, this question of where are you from? Where do you come from? And this has become a recurring thing that I've found, and it will happen on a daily basis. And I think that's influencing how much the shift has happened and why I think young curators and young artists are looking back because they feel like there might be something there.
Yeah.
That idea of hope, it comes back to this sense of solidarity and the way that I think you both and your peers as well organized yourselves at that point in the 80s to really come together and speak from one voice. And that's, I think, what we're lacking now.
Yes.
It's there, it exists, but it's not loud enough.
And it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because obviously the work can do one thing and the curation of the work can do one thing. But I think the backstories, which I think is what we've got up on these projections, a selection of, is the other thing that obviously, which is in the archive. It's in the institutional archives, in the various other spaces, which is the kind of the negotiations and the lobbying and the activity and activism that took place. And I guess in a way, for me, there's something quite interesting and the challenge, if you like, of how you think about that kind of 80s moment, that political space or cultural space that occurred and why it occurred at that point, and how that is taken forward in 2023, because that's your biggest challenge. I mean, Sunil was talking about, being able to go to a craft market, and meeting in the evenings and things. People have more difficulty doing that, right? So there's a fragmentation that has absolutely occurred, and so
cost of living,
and
there's
cost
so
of
many
living crisis as well.
Yeah,
so there's a way that it seems to me that the nitty gritty of looking at how that organizing happened has to be kind of thought through the frame of 2023 in a way.
And it's tricky. I think there's a lot more hostility in terms of the government trying to clamp down on, protesting, free speech.
Yes.
And that also instigates this
Voice.
sense of fear. And that, I think, also kind of begins to trickle down from there. I think what's interesting is that, I've heard Mark and Sunil, you both talk very recently about the 1980s as being this very contested space and it goes back to what Stuart Hall used to say about the idea of being this kind of constant space of negotiation. I think the idea, if we go kind of towards the work that you've both made, I think, Roshini, with you, the idea of returning home and what home means is very different to Sunil's experience of what home means. And I wonder if we could touch upon that, because I think the diasporic experiences of the South Asian community are so varied, we were speaking earlier this week, and it's interesting how now there is a real need to begin figuring out where communities have gone, where they exist, why they exist there, and how did they get there. And I think that's quite an interesting one now to be thinking about. And I wondered if you might want to kind of touch upon that.
Do you want to speak?
I just want to, before we leave that topic about the then and now and what was possible. So we mentioned economics have changed dramatically, but the funding has changed dramatically. So when I was leaving art school and we were finding our way, we had half a dozen in London alone photographic enterprises that were very local and small, camera work, and what's now photo fusion and so on. So autograph kind of made sense at that scale, very locally. It was not a unique thing. Other people were doing things, and all kinds of little art things were happening. And I think the anxiety now is that that's all being lost, and it's not being replaced. And I do wonder where young graduates today, my students, go when they leave, because there aren't those spaces anymore for them to get absorbed into, to experiment, to try, and to work with. And being a board member of a small London-based arts organization, Little Gallery, that foregrounds radical experimental work that institutions normally wouldn't or couldn't take for whatever reason, which is fair enough. So we have the smaller ones, but we're all under incredible pressure. People are burning out. The salaries are ridiculous, and it's unsustainable.
Because I think it becomes about box ticking at that point. There's a certain number of requirements that you have to make in order to get certain type of funding. And I think now it's changed as well, that everything has to be outcome focused. There has to be, if you apply for X amount, there has to be something tangible that comes out at the end. There isn't that space for, I guess, simple experimentation, research. No one is willing to fund that right now.
And it sort of goes back to the example. I mean, it was interesting you say that, because there's also a shift that the Arts Council has done, right? So the Arts Council and the art institutions have refocused, particularly because the money has been squeezed and we're in a more kind of right-wing kind of space, that the spaces of public discussion are closed down. We have no, when you actually think about where we could meet, there is no space to be able to meet. So there's something,
and the reorientation. For the institution to create it.
Well, but there's a reorientation as well of the art galleries towards an art market in a major way. And it seems to me that there was something quite interesting about the moment, particularly in photography, which we both talked a little bit about Barry Lane and the independent photography movement. There was something quite interesting about a commitment from the Arts Council and to kind of fund things that were a bit on the edge, more experimental, more, they're going to take a gambit with us, right? And that was definitely part of what the independence photography movement was about.
I remember
and Barry Lane.
clearly what he said. He said, we said, give us money for black photographers. And he said, what's that? You never heard of any.
Yeah.
And he said, well, I'll give you 2,000 if you write a report.
Yeah. So the access to it was easier. The spaces were there, and there was a willingness for the Arts Council to be more responsive rather than strategic. So for me, institutions have become strategic and directive. And that, to me, is really on the wrong foot, it seems to me, in terms of being able to understand and listen to what people are wanting to have happen at this point in time.
So, I mean, what do you think, for example, about Women in Revolt at the Tate? Is that a radical show? I mean, can it something like the Tate do a radical job of anything?
That's a whole other discussion.
I think
but I'm just saying, I mean, why are we going to see it? It's a relic. I mean,
in the same way that it seems to me that the 1980s is an important moment, right? And I think there is obviously a turn that's happened to actually recognize the women that have been invisible in relation to that. So how are we going to
find the revolting women today?
Well,
that's a good question. I think that's
thank you.
There's some out here.
But I think also, just to go back to what you were just saying, I think also the flip side of that is that I know with the work that we do at Autograph, there is a bigger need to serve a community of people that have been marginalized. We've been working with community groups and specific groups that are from refugee backgrounds. And that's what also is happening with smaller organizations. They're being lent upon more and more to be these safe spaces in which you can come, you can be, and there's no expectation from you. No one is checking, paperwork, papers, etc. And I think that's also the shift as well. It's like the demand is not just on the number of spaces that you might have to commission or exhibit artists, but it's also you're in the social care kind of aspect as well. And that's quite a lot, I think, as well, just because I think that's also important to highlight as well. It may be not in bigger institutions, but I know, the Baltic is doing that work on a daily basis. They have the space that's open that people can come in, have a cup of tea and feel that, it's their space to be in.
So maybe that's a good thing.
That's not what they tell me in Newcastle. I was just there.
Oh.
We were there doing a project and by this interesting person, Abdullah Qureshi, who teaches at Northumbria, and he was saying that my students don't see enough, they don't get enough stimulation. So he's literally inventing a little exhibition program through a private gallery, because the university where he's at can't take it. A series of shows to bring people, to bring work.
But that comes to representation in the gallery space, which I think is the other side of it, that I think everyone is still beginning to figure out how they do that in a more, it doesn't have to then be specifically a South Asia show or a diasporic show. It's about how do you bring those names together. And maybe that's where spaces like the Tate can do that, because they have a bigger kind of venue or arena and audience that will bring together so many different names. I mean, I don't want to speak on behalf of the Tate, but...
No, me neither. But, maybe we can shift a little bit, just because we're running out of time already. It's 1:45.
Okay, you've got 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah, but I really do want to take, we need questions from the audience as well. But I just wanted to really kind of reflect on the Confrontations show, which I don't know if people have seen this, but it was really interesting. I was just looking at it from 1992, and there was a really interesting way in which the idea of stereotyping was being exhumed, if you like, or spoken about, and there's all kinds of very interesting things in there around, how we were defining ourselves, through our biographies. For example, I said I was Indo-Guyanese, which and so those kinds of things start shifting, it seems to me, as you kind of move on. But I just wanted to have a conversation with you about changes in practices, and what you would say. I mean, for me, I'll start off with me. I think one of the things that I remember, that I'm very aware of, is a real change in practice all the time, and the idea of the aesthetics changing. And decentering, if you like, the idea of the central figure, right, of the central visibility of the Black figure. And I'm kind of interested in how that has persisted in your work, and the idea of the self-portraiture as well, self-portrait, which has been a fantastic kind of really it's been associated with the 90s, really, in a way, late 80s, early 90s, you know, how portraiture has really been quite significant to us thinking about artists of color and thinking about it. But I just wondered if you would say anything about how you feel your work has kind of changed and how.
Okay, so my work, or what I thought was my work, has changed to encompass a whole area of work. But what it's about hasn't changed. So if I could spell it out a bit, I came to London from New York with a bit of training from the New School, but a lot of informal training in New York and in North America. So my head, I was like a completely modernist photographer. That's what I thought I wanted to do and be. And I wanted to wander the world with my Leica and try film and be left alone to do modernist photography. So that has then transformed into a much wider engagement with activism, with teaching, with running workshops, with curating, which I didn't plan to do, but I was forced to do because nobody else was doing it, with writing essays, for other people's work, not just my own, and publishing small things, trying to be consistent with it, not just flitting around doing X, Y, and Z thing. For example, I worked with you several times over the years, because I think it's nice to be consistent, to see the developments, which way they can go. But meanwhile, in my work, when people ask me, what do you do? I say I'm a gay Indian man, and I'm interested in artistic representations of other gay Indian men. I've done that from the beginning, and I'm still doing it. And some people have said to me, Sunil, when are you going to grow out of this? It's like I'm suffering from some kind of arrested development, that I'm still some overgrown child. And but I say, but there's never been I never come to a conclusion.
No, sure.
It also keeps changing and transforming, and India's transformed into South Asia, and suddenly, I'm hugging Aziz. Who's reassuring me that hairy Indian men are back in fashion. So we don't have to have Brazilian waxes anymore, thank God.
But that goes also to how terminology has changed, like what you were saying right at the beginning, where the idea of being queer now has completely changed meaning from, how it was. I know Jamu is also the same when we worked with him. And, there was a young artist in the audience who'd asked him a question of what he defines as queer, and it was completely different to the way that now the next generation are looking at that. And I think it's that constant
shifting. Everybody's become queer. I get off the plane in Delhi and everybody's queer. Even the straight people are queer now. So I'm thinking, what happened here? No, because we used to be kind of a little bit shady and somewhat criminal. So hanging around in bushes. What they've done is chop all the bushes down. You could go to Russell Square and have sex on your way to Soaz. And you can't anymore because they've got rid of the blooming bushes. So and so everyone become queer and not having any sex. So that's what's happened. I suspect.
Yeah. I mean,
too
it's
busy
an
talking
interesting
Too
and
one.
busy
writing
talking.
about
Yeah,
it.
maybe that's.
I mean, I guess one of the things that I've been trying to do and refocus is partly because as you get older, you're not as kind of mobile or active as you once were in terms of doing things.
You're telling
as
me you should have seen last night and made me walk up the hill.
but the idea of actually. For me, it's about then looking at the younger generation and people in particular areas of power. And one of the things I'm really struck by is the lack of voice of women activists who are ecologists in the global south, in other spaces. So that the pieces that I'm doing at the moment, I'm looking to understand and think about representation of activism from an ecological perspective, and particularly women. And that for me is becoming now a driving force. So I shifted a little bit away from, the idea of self-identification and exploration of identity in that way, and thinking more to try and reflect more on the urgency of what we need to be grappling with in terms of, and obviously just as urgent in relation to queer representation.
We said this back in 1978. Heterosexual people insist on getting married, having children, creating more,
You're not
more
going to say
need
it, are
for
you?
accumulation of capital goods, buying more houses, buying more cars. They're the ones destroying the blooming planet. I think they need a good talking to.
That could be debated.
But I think it's interesting because I think what's the archive is becoming this thing, right? Where the archive becomes quite critical here, because without looking back, how do you look forward? And I think your new video piece that's downstairs that you've made for the show is incredible, because it's bringing together these kind of fragments of, language, history, ecology, but together in a very nuanced way, in which you can have these conversations that don't have to be, big grand gestures about how climate change is affecting us. We all know it's happening. But it's interesting, I think.
Thank you for saying that. I mean, I guess one of the things that I'm, like the 80s, and in a way I can see it in Sharon's and Sunil's work, is the idea of a kind of a positive space, a hope, a kind of an enrichment that you and for me there's something about
we could see it coming, the getting better part.
Yes, and it's about instilling hope, but also about imagining something else. And I think that for me is a really, really important thing now. Because we can really, as you said, climate change. Jesus, everybody would just turn off. There's an incredible way in which real anxiety is there about what's happening. And it seems to me that I really get strength from the women who are actually doing the work on the ground in those various places and bringing about change. But we need to.
And I think that's a good time to open it up if anybody has questions.
You can ask any questions about the things behind us or anything we've just said.
Or just make a comment.
Or just make a comment, yes, please.
Oh.
You're really prejudging. No, I actually wanted to ask you, firstly, thank you for just sharing this perspective, but also just ask you, one of the things you haven't reflected on very much is your teaching. And both of you are invested in teaching.
Sort of.
And from the outside looking in, to me, tertiary education risks, if not it has already become, a kind of an extension of the hospitality industry, where you check in your credit card and fill in customer surveys. So what do you bring of your activism and your willingness to kind of throw grit in the circulation of the smooth global industry, whether it be art or education? What are you doing in education?
It's the location of some very real activism. You bring to the curriculum your perspective. So as a person of color, you bring all of that curriculum. I bring Roshini's books, I bring Sonia's, I bring your catalogs into my classrooms to kids who would never have seen them otherwise, because none of the other staff have heard about it or are interested in talking about it. So I think one of the reasons why today is because a generation of people like us, dare I say, and the people who came through, have been running these educational workshops, classes, tutorials in the various colleges up and down the country, making race and queerdom an unquestionable right for everyone. I don't think any undergraduate thinks that there's anything wrong with being any color or any sexuality.
That's very true.
And it's because of we've been relentlessly at them. I showed Looking for Langston to my unsuspecting first-year class of undergraduates in Hull in 1990. And they said, why are we seeing this? We're all white and nobody's gay. Why did we just see this film?
Yeah, that's an old
story. Because I'm showing it to you. Now you have to contemplate it. So you kind of keep on at them. Did the same thing in Delhi with the activist groups. We started the course at NID, same thing, spread the thing. And so there was a slide in there where my biggest challenge actually, Hamad, was trying to do this in Hindi in India because... So here it's one thing, because we're all in English. But when you go to South Asia, there's a language issue. Then sometimes I feel in South Asia or in India, I'm just talking to the sodding elite, and I don't want to just do that. So teaching in Hindi to an art college which was full of young women learning painting and sculpture, who were destined to become basically, middle-class art teachers who teach other kids art somewhere. And when I talked about photography and queer issues to them, they were very excited. They said, nobody's mentioned, no one's ever talked to us about it. We're so glad to hear about it from somebody.
I mean, I think for me, I'm looking for activists, right? So I'm very I have a set of students who are doing their doctoral degrees who have all been interested in a level of activism and thinking through cultural practice and their own practice in relation to that, and all I can do is to support that, right? So I try and identify where they might be interested in joining us, and working in an institution that we work despite it, right? I mean, you're very right in how you've described the institution. It really is an uphill battle. It's exhausting. I mean, I noticed Denise here, and we were talking about that the other night, how exhausting it is being inside that institution all the time. I mean, somebody like Sunil is, you and I, we're both now part-time because we've done our bit and we're exhausted. And so it's for me, it's about then trying to make sure that kind of level of activism and thinking is instilled in the next generation, kind of getting into those positions.
Well, we just, at UCA, we've signed with us lot have put in a petition saying, as PhD supervisors, you're not paying us, because they pay you in this very weird way.
They don't pay.
And you're supposed to read whole chapters. And that takes time. They'd have to write something back. And they're just treating it like it's some kind of extracurricular thing.
I think the other thing that I'm really interested in doing in the university and have been doing for quite a long time in University of East London and Westminster is to think through how we actually change the curriculum from the kinds of material that students themselves are generating, right? So how do we think through, how do we facilitate a thinking that actually allows them to kind of question and bring a different way of thinking, a different way of mode of operating, a different set of methodologies, to their practice and their thinking. And for me, that's the challenge, because how you might rethink the notion of a thesis is really, really key, it seems to me, at this point in time. And that's about a refreshing of the kinds of thinking, who people cite in relation to the canon.
Because I've had to reject, I've become like the South Asian guy at UCA. So all the PhDs from the applications get diverted to me. Not only that, because India's become our great new economic partner, they're trying to they all go out fishing for them. So I had to reject all three recently because they were written in this weird way. I couldn't. I said they need a course in how to write the application.
Yeah.
And nobody's told them So our institution thinks, okay, we'll just go to South Asia and get students and not bother any kind of intermediary interaction.
No.
And the way the system is set up, right? I don't know if yours might be similar or different, but in our one, by the time it comes to me, there's no commentary. I can just say yay or nay.
Oh, wow.
And if I say yes, I know I'm looking at a whole year of taking this child through, from scratch, trying to figure out what his basic question is.
And you also put people at disadvantages.
Which is a lot of extra work,
You put people at disadvantages.
Yeah.
In doing
and then
that.
they've already lost a year because they didn't know what they were on about, huh?
I just wanted to ask a question.
Are you allowed to?
Because I think especially with your work, because you're just also talking about kind of these teaching that you've been doing in India, also like the kind of, because here we're talking about the institution, right? And the university, which is also very, like not everyone can kind of go through a university as well. Like, there's also this format of writing papers or writing a dissertation, and that also requires capital. But and again, when we think about queer circles and again, the diasporic circles and learning, right? And I know Chitra and Pamela also have that like later in their work, in their slides. But I mean, again, what you guys have been talking about from the 80s, what is the alternative to, like, what are the alternative pedagogical and kind of non-institutional? I know we're in an institution and all, but like spaces could be maybe like, think of like, I was just wondering like, where do you see that space today as well? Because in some way, again, as you said, the desire for everyone to be exhibited at the Tate, right? For everyone to kind of enter this. Also, again, this goes back to, right? If you have a PhD, you can become a professor or you can become a lecturer, right? If you have everyone has to have a bachelor's and a master's in their CV. We don't have this idea of the self-taught photographer, the self-taught artist as much as we used to. So where is that space now as well?
The onus is on you because so the group I joined in Delhi, when I went to live in Delhi, there was this, I was kind of taken into a group called Nigar. Nigar started at the university, all postgraduate students. Queer theory had come from Yale a few years earlier, so they got very involved. Queer theory became the thing. They began to have workshops in their academic institution for other students. Then they decided, and then also they were going to graduate, they suddenly thought, this needs to happen in the city, like outside the institution. But there's no natural space for it. There's no government-funded space. There's no private space. What do? They turn around and they make a kind of NGO that's not an NGO. So it's a group of people who are activists who create opportunities through meetings for the town and try and gather like-minded queers in the city to discuss all kinds of legal issues, health issues. They write pamphlets, they write manifestos. We wrote pamphlets about young lesbians, how to run away from their homes. They write manifestos about sexuality, what does that mean in South Asia today, etc. Why are we accepting all of this language coming from Yale and the US? What is our own Hijra Kothi population? What are they thinking about it, and so on?
But there is also, I mean, I'm kind of a bit hopeful with stuff that's going on in England. It seems to me that there's a set of younger people who are being facilitated through a network online environment. And have some great kind of writing and activity. It seems to me that the smaller organizations need to be doing stuff, right? I mean, the facilitation like Innova or Autograph, facilitating a kind of a different voice that isn't through the academic space, that actually still has an intellectual and creative kind of capacity to it, but also is nurturing kind of an ethical, kind of moral
there was the reading
and
group,
space, right? So I think we need to kind of really be supportive of that kind of online enriched experience. But that actually needs to be funded because people get exhausted, right? And they can't do it. And that needs to be kind of supported in a way. But somewhere like Innova is really good.
I think that's also quite interesting, though, because the rise of the artist collective or a collective of people that have a shared ambition is beginning to resurge. I'm seeing a lot of friends.
But they're not surviving. That's the problem. They're fragmenting.
That's, I think, that's a slightly separate question around the funding. But I think in terms of what Aziz was saying about how do people come together that aren't in these spaces
Yeah.
or don't know how to get into these spaces. I think the idea of self-organizing is becoming more and more
yeah, I
prevalent.
agree.
And I think it's how now the question is, how do you sustain that?
Yeah, that's right.
I just want to say congratulations, first of all, to Deborah and her team at the gallery for putting on this event. I mean, this is a house full. I'm so excited to be here. I wasn't planning to be here. I've left my kids and everything at home. So I was just like, I've got to get here. I've got to get here. So... myself. No. I don't need to do that. Thank you. I work for Creative Black Country, which is an organisation that brings local communities together. So whatever you were saying down there is absolutely spot on. We've got to get the work out to people rather than expecting people to come to venues all the time as well. So pleased that this work is in Walsall. What I wanted to ask was I noted something around students who we lose along the way because they give up. But how do you keep the students inspired and get them to keep going when you're teaching them? Because it's a tough world out there at the moment. And I just wanted to see if you've had any thoughts on that, because I've got kids of my own and I know there's a lot of young people who are, a little bit lost as well. Thank you.
I mean, I just spend a lot of time kind of being in touch with them all the time. It's really important to kind of, give that kind of support to find out if people are okay, if they need to take time, if they've gone away for a different reason, which I think also happens. So for me, it's giving space, but recognizing that their personal circumstances are such that they're not they're not in my situation, right? They're dealing with a lot more other things. So I accommodate that. So, I was doing a tutorial with somebody who was actually had to check out, right? And these things are possible. And it's about being flexible. It's about investing in those people in a way. And that's about giving time. And I don't know how else you do it. I really don't. And it's about then, for me, I also meet people in gallery spaces. That's the other thing. So we use galleries as tutorial spaces a lot of the time and try to just kind of sit and watch a film with them or something like that, right?
I think it's giving them also the space that if you meet them and, they feel that they want to ask more, that it's not restricted to that 15 minutes. So last week I met a wonderful artist at London College of Communication who's just graduated, and she's here today, which is really lovely. For her to be in the audience and feel that there's someone or some people that might be able to share more of what she was kind of talking about in that 15-minute slot that we had that might transcend that space, I think is really important. And it's that, but it's invisible labor that I think it also comes back to.
It's not accountable anywhere.
Yeah, you don't get paid for it extra.
I would withdraw that. I said to UCA, you're only giving me by the hour. I'm only working by the hour. Thank you. I'm not answering these emails out of hours.
Professorial
because
fellow,
then you're
Sunil.
but so I think with the PhD you can do that.
Yeah,
but if it's
also
an MA
in
class,
relation
it's
to
much more. Then it's a different ballgame.
Yeah, but I think it also depends on how your energy levels and how you.
Yeah.
What I find is that it's often sometimes with me at Farnham there are two at the MA level. Then there's sometimes two people, which I like.
Yeah.
Because then the two of us have a disagreement. And I think that's very good for all students to realize that as a teacher, my word is not gospel.
Yes, that's the other thing.
So it's very good to have more than one.
Really, it's a good point, actually. Because I think the idea of what people are bringing to the table and listening to younger people who have very, very different experiences. So for me, the university space is about a kind of an exchange space, or in the art institution is an exchange space, which is about, listening, asking people what they actually have to bring, right? And that to me also brings a level of commitment and a level of interest and passion into the space.
Also, I was going to say that, I was going to say our people, not our Asian students from South Asia, and even much more so from East Asia, are trained not to ask you any questions.
Yeah.
So they're all sitting there, pencil ready to copy down anything you say. And I'm saying, please don't do that.
Yes.
But that's
reorientating you have to do.
Yeah.
But then I think it goes back to what, Roshini, you were saying earlier about how the education system has shifted from that exchanging space, or from that kind of dialogue to becoming more of just you being that central figure and then having to impart knowledge for them to absorb and then maybe do something with.
Yeah.
Which the college wants to record,
Yeah.
like they're doing, and
Yeah.
then next time they just play that,
Wheel it
and
out.
you don't have a job anymore.
Is there any more questions? Aziz, I think you had a question you wanted to ask beyond, it was about specifically the question around Toronto and the exhibition you were saying in our exchange
that
earlier
was
this
late.
week.
I think that's for later.
I mean, just like what happens, like in terms of exhibition making. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't fully remember the question, but I think I was more like, no, I mean, I think it's, of course, with Sunil, right? I mean, it's been really cool also to see, again, we've talked about resurgence, and I guess if people like our generation are maybe responsible for it, like, curating these exhibitions, but again, referring to this history, I know you've had this retrospective, right? That happened. It was first in London, and then it went to Toronto. And then we were also discussing about that exhibition kind of still being in these capitals, right? And not like, in some way I was like, Deborah, why did this retrospective not come to like Walsall, right? Sorry, this is not, but more like where, like also where does like kind of exhibitions travel, right? And who gets to see what? And again, what is the purpose of that, right? And I mean, in some way also like Women in Revolt is happening at Tate, right? But where else? But it's probably not just a London-centric show, right? So where does that travel? What does that mean, right? So I would just be interested also in like thinking about that, right? Again, the role of like the non-center.
I think it's really important. Sorry. It's really important to for us to think in relation to education or knowledge to make use of online environments, because people are doing an enormous amount, like here as well. Microsite is an incredibly valuable thing, right? And it has to be used. Podcasts, they need to be used. There's an enormous amount of stuff that's being generated by the Tate Britain show, Women in Revolt, all online. So how do we as people who are, get people in a room and together look at the work? I really believe in watch parties. I think sitting and watching together, having a discussion around material is absolutely key. And that's how you can get to a different audience, it seems to me. And of course, kids, younger people are more interested in that online space as well, right?
But I also think it comes down to funding as well. I mean, last night we were speaking about how much a touring exhibition would cost a venue.
Yeah.
And it's absurd to me that the kind of price tags that they put on things just as an institutional fee, and that doesn't include then actually staging the show, it's kind of, there's no standard for it. There's no mechanism by which people are deeming something to be more valuable or less valuable than the next show. And I think there's also part of that conversation that, for Sunil's show to come to Walsall would be wonderful, but if the price tag that's being put on it is an obscene amount of money, that I think it creates that barrier again. And how do you access, how do people access that aren't living in big cities like London? Or, it's also the train fare as well. It is expensive in the UK to be traveling.
But there is a way, it seems to me, that live projections could be made more of in gallery spaces, right? That actually the link up, rather than a physical tour, a link up could happen, right? That actually would enable a kind of a sharing.
But then how many artists would want their work projected into a space?
I think artists have to get over things like that, right? We can't be dealing only with material objects at this point in time. It's not good for the planet, and B, it's expensive, as you're pointing out. So the idea of how you actually make more immersive spaces in gallery spaces for discussion and for enjoying that kind of, and then maybe bring the artists themselves to talk and bring stuff.
This exhibition will be accompanied by a dedicated microsite. And I think for us, the importance of that is that it's not a book. It doesn't have the same barriers as a book. It gives us the opportunity to continue to evolve this as the exhibition goes on. So it's not like a book where you have everything and then it goes in and it's finished, it's done. We can continue to respond to the way people respond to the exhibition. We can put in the visual documentation. And at the end of the day, when this exhibition finishes, this is going to be a lasting legacy and archive of this exhibition and everything that happened through it. So I think, we're all in the art world very keen on books, but as you say, it's not good for the environment. It's expensive. We want to think that everyone wants our book, and of course they don't necessarily want our book. So, for us, the microsite is something we feel we can experiment with quite a bit and see what happens. And this exhibition is on for 7 months, so we can continue to evolve it. We already have really fantastic essays on there by Dr. Alice Correa and Dr. Alpesh K. Patel, which are kind of not about the exhibition as such. They're kind of more frameworks for considering the exhibition. Aziz is going to be writing a piece which more fully responds to the exhibition itself. And of course, we'll be putting visual documentation in. And there's a whole range of resources that are available on there as well. So if you're a student and you're studying any of these artists, it's a great place to go and find lots of resources to look at. So that was a bit of a hard sell there, but we were talking about it, so I thought it's probably important just to contextualise that a little bit more and really kind of propose it as a way that we can continue to collect frameworks and use them as a lasting archive.
But then, Roshini, I do think as a maker, and I make my own prints, for me it's a work on paper, and I want people to see it.
Yeah.
I don't want to project
I mean,
it.
I understand that, but I think that's a very costly, and both on the earth and in relation to.
That's what I do. I'm a printer.
But I also just want to say,
I'm not a projectionist. It's not the image version, it's the actual thing.
It's the physicality of having the object.
But
it's important.
But it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I don't know. But if you think about younger people then consuming stuff, it's not through an object.
It has to be. I mean, I would argue it has to be on paper. When we started Camera Work Delhi, and everyone said, "Oh, it should be on the net." I said, "No. We try to find an audience for photography. It's something on paper. They have to physically be able to pick it up.
I think we're on the cusp of something that's changing.
I think it's a bigger dialogue.
It acquired so much intellectual space.
Yeah.
Right? And also it needed a big machinery to have the Google and something to make. And those are the ones who are actually controlling the climate that you were questioning about earlier on. So we don't want to support
I understand that.
companies who are also.
I understand that, but I think there is something about an audience, right? An engaging of an audience.
Yeah, but also,
you're not going to necessarily bring.
I think we are also intellectualizing the race that you're fucking Paki happening on the street, not in the university space, not in the gallery space. We also have to think about that. What are the other kind of intervention that needed to be? Because this is the question. That's what the work is about. So many other kind of conflicts that we're thinking about.
Yeah. I take all of that point, but I'm just saying that we're on the cusp of something else happening in terms of where our work is going to appear and how it appears and how people can get to it, right? So there, for example, the woman who kindly was talking about how wonderful it was to see the show in Warsaw. It's great, but how often. In terms of being able to, for people within your own community getting around physically in the UK, it just doesn't happen that easily.
Those mothers and those aunties who can't play the phone.
Yeah.
How do we then make them to understand?
There are ways that you do this, right?
No, but I think that's
We can't file the forms, which are pension forms and all kinds of things.
Sorry, I mean, it's a really interesting discussion going on here.
I think that Sharon is alluding to access.
Yeah.
Yeah,
On the
sure.
whole, the spectrum of access.
Yeah.
And I think that's the language.
But in a way, the access in other places in the global south are bigger, right? They're more substantial.
What we're talking about here is the class divide.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're talking about PhDs, and for me, I come from a working class background. Yeah. And the biggest frustration I have, and a lot of people in this room will know, that I'm not deemed intellectual enough. My intelligence, I might be an intelligent person, but because I haven't written something a certain way, I won't get that funding. And that is one of the biggest problems in the arts.
Exactly. No, I agree with
It is
you.
in London, but then it affects us in the West Midlands. Why should we have to move to London
Exactly.
But also, or why people in the global south should move to the global north to access.
We should get a bit of perspective of who lives here. I'm from Birmingham. 49% of the population in Birmingham in the last census were South Asian, predominantly Pakistani.
Great, yeah.
What did the Pakistani community of Birmingham get? I mean, it's fantastic to see you here. I think you said you worked with Mariam. You, Aziz and Mariam are the only two successes we've had in the arts in the last decade.
Yeah.
And, these are working class artists, so I think the access point, we've got to.
But I think this is change. I'm not dismissing or saying that we don't go ahead with print form, right? I'm just saying we're in a different moment where I think it seems to me that there will be a way that most people can access something somewhere in a public space, or it's rolled out in their schools, or that is almost inevitable that's going to happen. So it's really about how we actually facilitate that, as well as getting people.
And all of that, but how will we create a value? It's how do you make that essentially the thing.
Companies are getting rid of automated ATMs. Roshini, I've heard this before, that back in the 80s they said the computers are going to change us completely.
But we're not in the 80s
They're going to liberate us. They certainly didn't liberate us.
Okay, I'm gonna just. I think this is just because I think we have lunch after this, so this can actually continue. No, we can, and I think. But I also just want to say this. I think this is all great. I think it's incredible that there's this conversation, this debate. I also do want to say that I think as someone who has a Pakistani passport, right, lives in the global south, I kind of, and as a queer person, right, like there's this, and I mean, going back to the magazine culture, right, it was publishing, which made these communities possible, and things were circulating in this way that people couldn't see. I think Instagram has been a space where a lot of queer people have connected all over the world, right? But yet, I think there is something incredibly special, as you said, Sunil,
about the object.
About having why is the biennial so successful and so sexy, especially in the global south, right? I think it is about the desire to see certain things. I think, again, it's a much more complex thing. And I think, as you said, class, access, mobility, right? Like, why should people from Birmingham move to London? Why should people from Pakistan have to pay £400 to go to, London to see art? Is the same kind of, structure of, £400 visa. But I just want to say that let's pause it on this, right? In the sense that I think this is a disagreement, but also a debate kind of space and a kind of or like a complex.
It's a conversation.
Complex debate. And I think it is linked to funding and structures and access and many other things. But on that note, what I do want to say is thank you so much to all of you, to all three of you starting us off. Bindi.
Thank you.
For me, it's incredible to see the long relationship and the friendship and the network and everything that you guys have done, and to see it vibrant and alive and so complex.
And continuing.
Yes, and so with so much love for all of us and with us. So thank you so much again for a wonderful morning, for starting us off. And let's keep on chatting over lunch.